In the final phase of the war, not even the generals were safe. Decorated officers who had served the Reich for decades were arrested, humiliated, and executed without a real trial. Their rank, track record, or victories did not matter. A suspicion of disobedience was enough. The absolute power of Hitler turned obedience into law. A false move, a decision made at the front, or even passivity in the face of a conspiracy could seal a death sentence. Some were hanged in Plötzensee with piano wire, others shot in prison yards. The line between loyalty and betrayal was erased, and the repressive machine devoured its own ranks. Why did a regime that depended on the army decide to purge those who supported it? What led veteran officers to fall under the accusation of cowardice or treason? How did a military empire end up executing its own generals? Friedrich Fromm was born in Charlottenburg on the 8th of October of 1888. At that time, the city was still independent before being incorporated into Berlin. He came from a middle-class family without ties to the aristocracy or the Prussian high command. His military career was remarkable in a context where most promotions were reserved for officers of noble origin. From a young age, he directed his life towards a military career and received the standard Prussian military education based on strict discipline and technical instruction. In the year 1906, he joined the Imperial Army as an artillery cadet. This corps, considered especially technical, offered officers without aristocratic descent greater possibilities for advancement. During his early years, he distinguished himself for his organizational abilities and a constant interest in logistics and weaponry. 4 years later, he obtained the rank of lieutenant, securing a stable place in the military hierarchy. With the outbreak of the First World War, he was assigned to the Western Front, where he participated in operations in France and Belgium. Throughout the conflict, he rose to first lieutenant and later to captain. His experience in the conflict consolidated him as a staff officer focused on artillery fire coordination and troop supply management. He was awarded the Iron Crosses of first and second class, a common distinction among Prussian officers of his generation. He finished the war in 1918 without significant injuries and with a proper record. After Germany's defeat and the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, the Imperial Army was replaced by the Reichswehr, limited to 100,000 men. Thousands of officers were removed, but Fromm remained thanks to his specialization in artillery and armament. The reduced number of personnel facilitated faster promotions than in peacetime. During the 1920s, he served in artillery units and in armament offices linked to the military administration. In the Weimar Republic, the Reichswehr was characterized by obedience and the absence of partisan politics. Fromm shared that orientation, remaining a disciplined professional, focused on technique and in contact with artillery and supply commanders. In 1932, he had reached the rank of major, consolidated as a specialist in munitions. The arrival of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933 and the rearmament process created new opportunities. While some officers showed caution, Fromm adapted and was considered reliable. He joined the National Socialist Party, although without visible political activity. His decision was more a response to the need to ensure continuity in his career than to ideological convictions. In 1935, with the creation of the Wehrmacht, he was promoted to colonel and assigned to the General Staff of the Heer in areas of armament and replacements. He maintained good relations with Ludwig Beck, then Chief of the General Staff, who valued him as an efficient administrator. 2 years later, he was appointed head of armament and the replacement command. That position gave him significant power as the Ersatzheer controlled the training and assignment of recruits, in addition to ensuring internal security. All new soldiers passed through its structure before being sent to the front. The annexation of Austria in 1938 and the general mobilization of 1939 further increased the importance of the Ersatzheer. From his position, Fromm knew in detail the actual capacity of the German army to sustain prolonged campaigns. The reports he supervised warned about the limits of mobilization and the difficulty of covering casualties in a total war. During the first years of the world conflict, he maintained a low political profile, but his influence aroused suspicion among regime figures. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, distrusted a command that had troops within Germany, particularly in Berlin. His power made him a potential actor in any conspiracy. Hitler, however, valued his administrative efficiency and kept him in the position. The function of the Ersatzheer became essential after the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when losses on the Eastern Front grew exponentially. Fromm developed reorganization plans to sustain combat capability despite casualties. In recognition of his work, he was promoted to General of Artillery in 1939 and to General Colonel in 1940. By 1942, he was one of the highest-ranking officers without having commanded troops in the field, a situation that created tensions with colleagues who attributed his promotion to administration rather than combat merits. The Ersatzheer was composed of 20 military districts spread throughout Germany with replacement divisions and training centers. Fromm oversaw recruitment, basic training, and distribution of soldiers. Each year, hundreds of thousands of men passed through his command. He also had authority over internal security units responsible for protecting strategic installations or suppressing disturbances. His responsibility also included coordination with the arms industry. As head of armaments, he had to ensure that the soldiers had the necessary material. His relationship with Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, was close, though not always free of friction. Speer valued his ability to clearly present technical problems in meetings with Hitler, but that same frankness generated tensions with Keitel and with Goebbels. In 1942, Hitler restricted Fromm's access to private meetings with Speer after disagreements over strategic reserves. Despite this, he remained in the position, leading a department that continued to be essential for prolonging the war effort. The confrontation with Keitel became a constant. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht sought to subject the Ersatzheer to the direct control of the High Command, while Fromm defended its autonomy. Goebbels's distrust reinforced these tensions, with accusations in his diaries about the general's questionable loyalty. As the war tilted against Germany, Fromm's position acquired a more delicate character. He had privileged access to information about the increasing casualties, the difficulties in recruiting, and the decrease in armaments production. That knowledge made him a key figure for those officers seeking alternatives to the current political and military leadership. The reserve army he headed was not at the front, but it constituted a force capable of intervening in the internal fate of the Reich. On the 20th of July 1944, early in the afternoon, an explosive charge detonated in the conference room of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The explosion destroyed part of the wooden structure, caused several deaths and left injuries, but the dictator survived with minor injuries. Within minutes, the news began to spread towards Berlin. Amid the initial confusion, contradictory messages circulated. Some claimed that Hitler was dead, others reported that he was injured but alive. In his office at the Bendler Block, headquarters of the Reserve Army in Berlin, Friedrich Fromm received the first reports of the explosion. His situation was especially delicate. For several months, he had been aware that there were officers dissatisfied with Hitler, some of them under his command. Klaus von Stauffenberg, his deputy chief of staff, had participated in secret meetings and had become a central figure in preparing the attack and the coup that was to follow the Führer's death. Fromm had not reported such activities, but neither had he joined the conspiracy. His attitude had been one of waiting, aware that, as the supreme head of the Reserve Army, any outcome would place him at the center of the crisis. That same day, Stauffenberg returned to Berlin after placing the bomb and, together with his companions, activated Operation Valkyrie. The plan, originally conceived to ensure order in case of internal uprisings, had been modified in order to be used as an instrument of the coup d'état. Its implementation contemplated the mobilization of units of the Reserve Army in Berlin and in other cities to arrest Nazi leaders, control official buildings, and ensure the control of communications. To achieve this, Fromm's signature was indispensable, or alternatively his neutralization to issue orders in his name. When Stauffenberg presented himself at the Bendler Block, he informed Fromm that Hitler had died in the explosion. He demanded that he join the operation and endorse with his authority the planned mobilization. Fromm, skeptical due to the lack of clear evidence, refused to commit. Faced with his resistance, the conspirators decided to arrest him and kept him confined in one of the building's quarters. To legitimize their orders, they forged his signature on the documents that set Valkyrie in motion so that the mobilized troops would receive instructions that seemingly emanated from their natural chief. The atmosphere in Berlin became confused. In some garrisons, the officers obeyed the orders coming from the Bendler block, believing they came from Fromm. In others, loyalty to Hitler prevailed, and communication was awaited directly from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The situation escalated when messages from the Wolf's Lair were confirmed. Hitler was alive and had made direct contact with Berlin. The credibility of the conspirators weakened immediately. In the Bendler block, Fromm continued under arrest while the coup was collapsing. As the afternoon progressed, troops loyal to the regime began to surround the building and the pressure increased. By midnight, the operation was practically defeated. The main conspirators, including Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Olbricht, and Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, were isolated. At that moment, Fromm was freed and regained command. His reaction was immediate. He ordered the formation of a summary court-martial against the main parties involved. General Ludwig Beck, also present in the Bendler block, attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself but survived wounded. Fromm ordered him to be executed immediately. Shortly after, Stauffenberg, Olbricht, and Haeften were taken to the courtyard of the building and shot within a matter of hours, without formal trial or possibility of defense. The procedure was rushed and carried out swiftly. The decision to act that way responded to Fromm's need to reaffirm his loyalty to the regime and to erase any suspicion of connivance. He knew that his silence regarding the activities of his subordinates could be interpreted as complicity. With the immediate execution, he attempted to present himself as the officer who had suppressed the coup, not as someone who had allowed it. However, the effect was the opposite. When Joseph Goebbels heard about the executions, he remarked that Fromm had been too hasty in burying witnesses. In the leadership circle, it was interpreted that his actions were not seeking justice but self-protection. Moreover, Hitler had ordered that the conspirators be captured alive to be interrogated and used in public trials. The shooting thwarted those plans. Heinrich Himmler, tasked with directing the subsequent repression, considered Fromm's conduct as an indication of indirect participation in the plot. In the following days, Fromm was arrested by the Gestapo on Himmler's orders. His case was referred to the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court presided over by Roland Freisler. Although no conclusive evidence of direct involvement in the attack was presented, he was accused of cowardice and negligence for not having prevented the conspiracy in his own general staff. The court held that, as commander of the reserve army, he was responsible for the discipline and loyalty of his subordinates. During the process, the documents that could link him to the conspiracy had been signed under duress or forged. The defense insisted that there were no elements to incriminate him, but the trial obeyed political rather than legal criteria. The speed with which he had ordered the coup plotters to be executed became one of the main pieces of evidence against him. For the tribunal, it was an opportunistic gesture that confirmed his lack of loyalty to the Führer. The verdict was the death sentence. In his diary, Goebbels wrote that Fromm had acted with weakness and deserved the punishment. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, tried to intercede in his favor. He drafted an extensive document in which he defended Fromm's career as an effective military administrator. His attempt was futile. The decision was made in advance. Fromm's conviction was part of the repressive wave that followed the 20th of July. In a few weeks, thousands of people were arrested. About 200 were executed, and nearly 5,000 sent to prison or concentration camps. High-ranking officers like Erwin von Witzleben and others involved were executed in Plötzensee prison, many of them by hanging with metal wires. Fromm's execution was not due to specific evidence, but to the political logic of eliminating any trace of autonomy in the military leadership. In March of 1945, he was transferred to the Brandenburg-Gurden prison, where the sentence was carried out. Unlike most of those condemned by the conspiracy, Fromm was executed by firing squad, a method considered more dignified within the military tradition. That difference reflected an implicit recognition of his rank, although it did not nullify the condemnation of cowardice that hung over him. Fromm's outcome shows how, in the final months of the war, the line between loyalty and betrayal was blurred in the daily practice of military commanders. His attempt to save himself by hastening the execution of the conspirators did not ensure his protection, but rather reinforced the suspicion that he was acting in his own interest. In a system where absolute loyalty was the only guarantee of survival, this ambiguity became his definitive sentence. After the guilty verdict issued by the Volksgerichtshof, Friedrich Fromm was transferred to the Brandenburg-Gurden prison, located about 70 kilometers west of Berlin. Since 1940, this complex had become one of the main execution centers of the Reich, equipped both for military shootings and decapitations by guillotine. Fromm's arrival in March of 1945 placed him in the same destination as hundreds of political opponents, common criminals, and officers accused of treason. The transfer coincided with the military collapse of the Third Reich. The Red Army was advancing towards the Oder River, and the German capital was a few weeks away from being surrounded. Despite the imminence of defeat, the judicial and repressive apparatus continued executing sentences. Internal discipline was considered a priority, even in a context of military disaster. Fromm, as a high-ranking general, was treated according to military protocol, not as a common prisoner. During the days prior to the execution, he remained confined in an individual cell. The prison records indicate that he was formally informed of the sentence and was offered the possibility to make one last statement. According to testimonies gathered after the war and references in Albert Speer's memoirs, Fromm expressed that he had always served Germany and that his intention had been to seek the best for the country. That statement was recorded as his final official words. On March 12, 1945, in the morning hours, the guards led him to the execution yard of Brandenburg-Gurden. It was an enclosed space within the penitentiary grounds usually intended for military executions. Unlike others involved in the July 20th conspiracy, executed in Plötzensee through methods designed for public humiliation, Fromm received the treatment reserved for generals. A firing squad carried out the sentence swiftly. The protocol followed strict steps. The condemned was taken to the place accompanied by an officer who read the judicial resolution. In front of him stood a squad made up of several soldiers lined up to fire simultaneously. In some cases, the convict was offered a blindfold to cover his eyes. In others, the possibility to refuse it. There are no clear records about Fromm's choice. According to later reports, he uttered a phrase before the shot in which he claimed to die because it had been ordered, reiterating that he had always wished the best for Germany. After the order to fire, the projectiles hit the torso and death occurred immediately. The body was removed and taken to the local crematorium. A public funeral or an identifiable burial was not authorized. The final destination of the remains was not recorded, following the practice of erasing physical traces of those condemned for treason. In the Nazi leadership circles, the reactions reflected the ambiguity of his figure. Joseph Goebbels recorded in his diary that Fromm had received the deserved punishment for his cowardice. He emphasized that no direct links to the attack could be proven, but his lack of measures to prevent it justified the condemnation. The official interpretation presented him as an officer who had not shown the necessary firmness to safeguard the Führer. Albert Speer, in contrast, narrated in his memoirs that he tried to intercede on behalf of Fromm before the execution. In a letter addressed to Justice Minister Otto Thierack, he defended the general's administrative career and argued that the sentence lacked an objective basis. Thierack dismissed the request, noting that the decision came directly from Hitler and that there was no room for reconsideration. Speer would later recall that even in informal conversations, he received responses confirming that Fromm's fate was sealed. The execution was part of a broader wave of purges after the 20th of July. While the main conspirators were displayed as open traitors, Fromm's case represented a different category, that of officers accused of passivity or failing to prevent the conspiracy. His fate served as a warning to other military commanders, reminding them that inaction could be considered as dangerous as direct participation. The choice of execution by firing squad rather than hanging, as well as the absence of filming, distinguished his process from other executed individuals. The regime did not consider him a priority political enemy, but rather an officer whose ambiguity could not be tolerated. The method used sent a specific message. Even high-ranking generals could be eliminated if the slightest lack of loyalty was perceived. The preserved documentation on the procedure is limited. Much of the information comes from memoirs and fragmentary records of the People's Court. No graphic records are available, which distinguishes it from other cases where Hitler ordered executions to be filmed for private use. Consequently, Fromm's death remained discreet, without propagandistic value to the outside, although commented on within the party environment and recorded in Goebbels' notes. His figure was marked by that intermediate condition. For the regime, he was the example of an officer who had not demonstrated the firmness required at a critical moment. For some contemporaries, on the other hand, he represented an efficient administrator who was eliminated for political convenience. His end in Brandenburg symbolized the closure of a career characterized by the control of one of the most influential military apparatuses of the Reich, and, at the same time, showed to what extent the repression reached high-ranking officers in the final months of the war. Hans Emil Otto Graf von Sponeck was born on the 12th of February of 1888 in Düsseldorf. He was the youngest child and only son of Emil August Joseph Anton Graf von Sponeck and Maria Kurtin. The early death of his father that same year left the family under the care of the mother. His childhood was spent in Freiburg im Breisgau, in an environment marked by the noble surname that granted him social prestige, although the family was not part of the most influential elites of the Prussian aristocracy. In 1898 he entered the Cadet Corps of Karlsruhe. There he received classical military instruction, with general studies combined with physical and tactical training. He stood out as a gymnast and soccer player, in addition to obtaining the position of chief cadet at the age of 17, a position that reflected his leadership ability. On the 19th of March of 1908, he was appointed lieutenant of the Imperial Army. That same year he got married and shortly after attained the rank of captain, consolidating his position in the officer corps. During the First World War, he served as an infantry officer at the front, functioning as a battalion aide. He was wounded on 3 occasions and progressively rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1916. He received the Iron Crosses of the first and second class in recognition of his service. At the end of the conflict, he joined the group of officers who sought to continue their careers in the reduced army of the Weimar Republic. Between 1924 and 1934, he held various positions in the general staff. He was the head of an infantry regiment in Neustrelitz, and in 1925 he received the distinction of Honorary Knight of the Order of St. John, an institution linked to the Prussian noble tradition. Until the end of 1937, he led the 48th Infantry Regiment in Döberitz, a post considered prestigious. In that period, he was transferred to the Luftwaffe with the mission of organizing parachute units, which demonstrated the versatility of his career. In February of 1938, during the crisis generated by the Blomberg-Fritsch case, he was promoted to Major General. His name appeared indirectly linked to Werner von Fritsch when some indicated that Sponeck had shown readiness to support him against Hitler. Although that did not go beyond rumors, it was recorded in the archives of the time. That same year he testified at the Fritsch trial, where Hermann Göring, as president of the tribunal, treated him with disdain. Despite these tensions, he was appointed commander of the 22nd Infantry Division, responsible for training airborne troops. With the beginning of the Second World War, his career took a new direction. On the 1st of February 1940, he was promoted to Lieutenant General, and his division participated in the offensive against the Netherlands in May of that year under the command of Kurt Student. The objective was to capture strategic positions in The Hague through an airborne attack. The operation did not achieve the expected success. The parachute forces suffered considerable losses, and Sponeck was almost taken prisoner by Dutch troops. He managed to escape, but the episode marked the campaign. Days later, the bombing of Rotterdam and the surrender of the Netherlands altered the balance of the operation. Despite the initial results, his performance was recognized as a bold action, and he received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of the highest distinctions of the German army. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, Sponeck was assigned to the 11th Army under the command of Erich von Manstein. His unit was part of Army Group South with the mission to advance through Ukraine towards Crimea. After a period of sick leave, he returned to the front and took command of the 42nd Army Corps, to which the 46th Infantry Division was subordinated. His main responsibility was to secure the Kerch Peninsula following the initial advance. On the 26th of December of 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive in Crimea began. troops landed in Kerch and on Mount Opuk with support from reinforcements planned for Feodosia. The operation threatened to encircle the 46th Division on the peninsula. On the 28th of December, Sponeck's forces managed to eliminate one of the beachheads, but the risk of isolation remained. He requested authorization to withdraw to the Parpach Isthmus and reorganize the defenses, but the higher command denied his request 3 times. On the 29th of December, the situation became critical. Soviet troops landed in Theodosia, which directly threatened the division's rear. Sponeck had less than half an hour to decide. Contrary to orders, he ordered the withdrawal. His intention was to prevent his 10,000 soldiers from being encircled. The maneuver was carried out in extreme conditions, below zero temperatures, blizzards, and lack of supplies. For almost 2 days, the units marched west, losing numerous men to frostbite and exhaustion. Most of the horses died, and much of the heavy equipment, including the artillery, was abandoned. On December 31st, the division reached the Parpach Strait, where it improvised a defensive line. On January 1st, 1942, the Soviets launched a new attack, which was contained thanks to artillery support transported by rail. The reinforcements allowed the destruction of 16 T-26 tanks and the stabilization of the positions. The withdrawal ordered by Sponeck had avoided the destruction of the division, although with the loss of a large part of the heavy equipment and in open disobedience to the orders to maintain the position. The Kerch episode defined the trajectory of Hans Graf von Sponeck. On the one hand, he had saved his troops from almost certain annihilation. On the other, he had disobeyed a directive demanding that they hold without retreating, a policy established by Hitler after the first defeats of the Soviet winter. The decision of an Army Corps commander to withdraw his units constituted a direct challenge to that policy, at a time when the regime was reinforcing absolute discipline at all levels of command. On January 23, 1942, the judicial process against Lieutenant General Hans Graf von Sponeck began in Berlin. The military tribunal was presided over by Hermann Göring in his capacity as Reich Marshal and President of the Reichstag. The accusation focused on disobedience on the battlefield. He was charged with having ordered the withdrawal of the 46th Infantry Division from the Kerch Peninsula without authorization from the higher command, contravening express orders to maintain positions at any cost. The procedure was brief. The defense argued that the decision had not constituted an act of insubordination, but an indispensable tactical measure to avoid the destruction of the division. Sponeck explained that the situation had changed after the Soviet landing in Theodosia and that, when ordering the withdrawal, he had less than half an hour to prevent a complete encirclement. He recalled that he had requested authorization on 3 occasions, all of which were rejected. The court acted conditioned by the policy established by Hitler since December of 1941. No withdrawal could take place without direct approval. That directive had become dogma. The prosecution emphasized that although the maneuver had saved thousands of soldiers, it resulted in the loss of heavy equipment and contradicted superior orders. The verdict was the death sentence. Sponeck was found guilty of disobedience and sentenced to be shot. However, Hitler decided to commute the sentence to 6 years of imprisonment. The motivation for this decision was not clearly recorded. Some sources suggest that he valued the general's previous track record and preferred to make him an example of broken discipline rather than eliminate him immediately. Other contemporaries noted that the intervention of Heer officers who respected Sponeck might have influenced the commutation. After the sentence, he was transferred to the fortress of Germersheim in Rhineland-Palatinate, a military building converted into a prison. There he began his period of confinement. The regime for high-ranking officers differed from that imposed on common prisoners. Sponeck had an individual cell, could read and write, and received visits from his family. His wife traveled from Berlin frequently and was allowed to stay with him for 1 week each month. His young son, Hans Christoph, also visited, who was then 5 years old. Everyday life in Germersheim was marked by isolation. Contact with the outside world was limited and all communication was supervised. Sponeck devoted time to reading, physical exercises, and correspondence, always subject to censorship. In his letters, he refrained from political comments and focused on family matters. The prison did not represent a place of extreme physical punishment, but rather an environment of permanent uncertainty. The high-ranking inmates were aware that their fate depended on political decisions in Berlin. Although the formal sentence was 6 years, Sponeck knew that Hitler could modify it at any time, either to arrange his execution or, in exceptional circumstances, his release. The surveillance by the Gestapo remained constant. Heinrich Himmler included him on lists of officers considered unreliable. Although there was no evidence that he participated in conspiracies, his disobedience in Kirch and his reputation as an independent officer were enough to place him under suspicion. For the regime, the lack of explicit adherence to the party amounted to a latent threat. Within the High Command, his name remained a subject of debate. Some considered him an example of what happened when discipline was broken. Others, especially former comrades, saw him as an officer who had prioritized the survival of his men over rigid orders. None of these opinions had a practical effect, but they kept the discussion about his figure alive. In political terms, Sponeck occupied an ambiguous position. He was not an open opponent of the regime, but neither was he an active supporter. He had fulfilled his military duties without identifying with the party's ideology, and that distance made him suspicious to the authorities. In Germersheim, he maintained military habits. He was governed by routines of order and punctuality, and those who knew him in that period described him as a reserved man without expressions of resentment, but also without optimistic expectations. The war advanced outside the walls while he remained apart, without certainty about his future. The material conditions were maintained during the first few years, although they deteriorated as the conflict dragged on. The general scarcity also reached the prison, although high-ranking officers received somewhat better rations than the common prisoners. Sponeck supplemented his diet thanks to the packages sent by his family. The relationship with the guards was distant but respectful. Contact with his wife and his son was a determining factor in his life as an inmate. The visits, although controlled, offered a link with the outside. Years later, his son would remember those stays as brief encounters, marked by the rigidity of the penitentiary environment but laden with family significance. As the months passed, the deterioration of the Reich's military situation became evident even behind the prison walls. The Soviet advances and the Allied bombings on German territory altered the atmosphere in Germersheim. The rumors reached the inmates through the official press and the guards' comments. Sponeck followed these news with attention, although without access to insider information. In 1943 and 1944, with the growth of conspiracies against Hitler, the prisoner officers acquired a symbolic value. Sponeck, although he was not part of any conspiratorial network, was seen as someone who in the past had questioned the policy of absolute resistance. For Himmler, he represented a general whose eventual release could encourage indiscipline within the army. On the 20th of July, 1944, while German officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler with a bombing at the Wolf's Lair, Hans Graf von Sponeck was imprisoned in the Germersheim fortress, where he was serving the sentence imposed 2 years earlier for his decision to withdraw the 46th Infantry Division from the Kerch Peninsula. In prison, he heard the news via the radio. Like the other inmates, he had no access to details, only to the official announcements that proclaimed the coup's failure and the Führer's survival. The reaction of the regime was immediate. Hitler appointed Heinrich Himmler as the direct person responsible for the repression, giving him control over the investigation and the execution of measures against suspects. Among the first names indicated was that of Sponeck. His history of disobedience in Kerch made him, in Himmler's eyes, a potentially dangerous officer, even though he had been imprisoned since 1942. The decision was clear-cut. He had to be eliminated before he could become a symbol for other military commanders. The order arrived without additional judicial proceedings. There was no trial before the People's Court, nor a new court-martial. The instruction was to carry out the pending execution by firing squad without further delay. In this way, the regime linked his elimination with the July 20th conspiracy, even though there was no evidence that he had participated in it. The speed of the decision responded to the logic of widespread purge that characterized those days. The 23rd of July of 1944 was set as the date of the execution. In the morning, Sponeck was informed of the outcome. According to the testimony of a priest who assisted him in his final hours, He received the news calmly and requested to participate in the Eucharist before being taken to the place of execution. The chaplain administered the sacraments to him in the prison chapel and recorded that the general expressed his Christian faith and his conviction of having always acted in accordance with his military duty. After the religious ceremony, he was taken to the yard designated for executions. Unlike other officers directly involved in the assassination attempt, who would be hanged in Plötzensee prison under humiliating conditions, Sponeck was subject to the procedure reserved for generals, death by firing squad. The difference was due both to his rank and because his conviction stemmed from an act of military disobedience rather than direct political conspiracy. The protocol was followed without alterations. The squad, composed of several soldiers under the supervision of an officer, stood in front of the prisoner. He was offered to cover his eyes and tie his hands, but he refused both options. He preferred to face the executioners with his eyes uncovered and his arms free. According to the priest's testimony, before receiving the order to fire, he uttered a few brief words. For 4 decades, he had served Germany and trusted that his death could mean a better future for his homeland. The order was given immediately. The shots hit his torso and death occurred instantly. The chaplain later recounted that Sponeck remained upright until the final moment, without visible signs of hesitation. After the execution, the body was removed quickly. A public funeral or memorial ceremony was not authorized. He was buried discreetly in Germersheim, under the strict rule prohibiting speeches or acts that could transform his death into a symbolic gesture of opposition. Only a Lord's Prayer was allowed to be said at the burial, without mention beyond his name and rank. The family was informed later. His wife was forbidden to organize a funeral in Berlin and could not hold public acts of remembrance. His son, Hans Christoph, was too young to understand the scope of the news. The family memory remained associated with the years of imprisonment and supervised visits, with no possibility of a formal farewell. In the years afterwards, the Allied occupation authorities and then the German administration exhumed the remains of Sponeck. They were moved to the military cemetery in Dahn, in the Palatinate forest. There he was buried alongside other officers who died during the war. In that new burial, a limited official recognition was allowed, strictly military in nature with no political references. The execution of Sponeck was part of the repression that followed the 20th of July. Although he was not one of the conspirators, his profile as a general who in the past had disobeyed orders made him a target of the purge. For the regime, eliminating him was a warning to all officers. Even those who had not participated in the plot could be executed if at some point they had shown independence. The impact of his death was felt in military circles that had known him since the First World War. Some considered it a reminder of the consequences that could occur from acting with one's own judgment in a system based on unconditional obedience. For the regime, however, his name was reduced to a note in the official records, with no public mentions beyond what was essential. The Germersheim episode represented the culmination of Sponeck's trajectory. In a span of a few years, he went from being decorated with the Knight's Cross to dying executed by order of Himmler. The brevity of the procedure, the absence of trial, and the prohibition of a funeral were characteristic traits of the repressive wave that spread after the attempt on Hitler's life. The transfer of his remains to Dahn in the post-war period allowed his memory to be integrated into the German military narrative of the war. His grave, alongside those of other generals, symbolized the destruction of the army in the final years of the conflict and the inclusion of executed officers in the same framework as those who had died in combat. The death of Hans Graf von Sponeck on the 23rd of July of 1944 was part of a chain of executions that the regime carried out following the failure of the attack. His profile, different from that of the active conspirators, showed the extent of the repression, which was not limited to the direct perpetrators but also reached those who, in the past, had questioned with their actions the policy of absolute discipline. The Reich devours its generals, the purge after the 20th of July. The failure of the assassination attempt of the 20th of July of 1944 opened a period of systematic repression within the Wehrmacht. Adolf Hitler, convinced that the army was infiltrated by disloyal officers, entrusted Heinrich Himmler and the Gestapo with the elimination of all those involved and those who had shown the slightest ambiguity. Within a few weeks, hundreds of officers were arrested, interrogated, and sentenced. The repression was not limited to the direct conspirators. It extended to their circles of friendship, former collaborators, and those who at some point had expressed doubts about the conduct of the war. The purge reached the highest ranks of the military hierarchy. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben was the highest-ranking officer linked to the plot. The conspirators had designated him as the future commander-in-chief of the armed forces in case the coup succeeded. His prestige as a veteran of the First World War and as a commander in the France campaign in 1940 made him a figure of reference. After the failure, he was arrested and brought before the Volksgerichtshof, presided over by Roland Freisler. The trial, held on the 8th of August, became a propaganda spectacle. Freisler constantly interrupted, shouted insults, and forced the defendants to appear in humiliating conditions. Witzleben, of advanced age, appeared in a shabby uniform without a belt and had to hold up his pants with one hand while he spoke. The images were recorded to reinforce the regime's propaganda. The sentence was the death penalty. Instead of the firing squad reserved for high-ranking officers, hanging was arranged. That same day, he was transferred to Plötzensee prison in Berlin. There he was executed with piano wire, suspended from meat hooks along with other defendants. The execution was filmed by direct order of Hitler, who wished to witness the deaths of the conspirators. The chosen method, slow and degrading, underscored the exemplary nature of the punishment. Another of the main names was Colonel General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of the General Staff of the Heer between 1900 and 1910-35 and 1938. He had resigned in protest over the plans to invade Czechoslovakia and since then had kept in contact with opposition circles. In the July 20th plan, it was intended for him to assume the head of state in a provisional government. During the night of the coup, Beck was in the Bendler block alongside Klaus von Stauffenberg and Friedrich Olbricht. Seeing that the operation was collapsing, he requested permission to commit suicide. He shot himself in the temple, but the shot was not fatal. Gravely wounded, he was finished off by order of Fromm. His death was not broadcast by the regime, although his figure became associated with the main circle of the conspiracy. The repression also reached officers who had maintained opposition networks since previous years. Among them were Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and General Hans Oster, his closest collaborator. Both had been under suspicion since 1943, when the Gestapo discovered hostile activities within the military intelligence. Canaris had protected opponents and maintained contacts with critical sectors of the regime. He was arrested shortly after the 20th of July and accused of indirect complicity. Oster, dismissed in 1943, was equally detained. After months of imprisonment, they were transferred to the Flossenbürg concentration camp in April of 1945. On the 9th of April, by direct order of Himmler, a group of officers considered especially dangerous was executed: Canaris, Oster, General Karl Sack, and Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They were hanged in the camp yard and buried in unmarked graves, following the practice of eliminating all traces of the opponents. These executions, carried out weeks before the collapse of the Reich, showed the priority that the regime gave to internal repression even when the front was lost. The scope of the purge also included top-level organizers of the Valkyrie plan. General Friedrich Olbricht was executed on the night of the 20th of July in the courtyard of the Bendler block along with Stauffenberg and Werner von Haiften. General Erich Höppner, dismissed in 1941 for disobedience in the Russian campaign and later linked to the resistance, was tried by the Volksgerichtshof and hanged in Plötzensee. Other officers met the same fate. Paul von Haase, military commander of Berlin, was executed for his involvement in the operation. Alexander von Falkenhausen, military governor of Belgium, was detained and interrogated, and Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, military chief in France, attempted to commit suicide after the failure of the coup, going blind before being arrested and subsequently executed. Even officers with no direct contact with the conspiracy were victims of summary executions. In many cases, suspicion or personal relationship with the conspirators was enough to be prosecuted. Sentences were passed in a few hours and were carried out immediately. The regime used these deaths as a propaganda tool. Joseph Goebbels ensured that the trials presided over by Freisler were filmed and that the recordings showed the accused in degrading situations. The objective was to send a clear message to the Wehrmacht: treason was paid for with public humiliation and painful death. Hitler personally arranged for the Plötzensee executions to be recorded on film. The prisoners were hanged with piano wire, a method chosen to increase the suffering, and the recordings were shown in private sessions for the Führer and his close circle. The immediate effect was to reinforce the climate of fear within the army. Officers who until then had expressed doubts about the conduct of the war minimized any comments. The certainty that no rank, not even that of field marshal, offered protection against repression was imposed in the Wehrmacht. The executions of 1944 and 1945 sealed the fate of a generation of German officers who had held the highest positions. From Witzleben and Beck to Canaris and Oster, the repression eliminated both active opponents and those suspected of disloyalty. Hitler's policy made personal adherence the absolute criterion and weakened the army through a purge that coincided with the military collapse on all fronts.